On the 27th of October, 1921, a wedding photograph was taken in Dublin that would become one of the most haunting images in Irish history. In it, three men stand together in the back row, smiling. On the left is Eamon de Valera, President of the Irish Republic. In the centre is the groom, Kevin O'Higgins, a young government minister. And on the right, standing as best man, is Rory O'Connor, a Republican engineer and one of O'Higgins's closest friends since their school days at Clongowes Wood College. Within 14 months of that photograph, O'Higgins would sign the order for O'Connor's execution. Within 6 years, O'Higgins himself would be assassinated in reprisal. And the country they had all fought to free would spend the next century defined not by the war they won against Britain, but by the war they fought against each other. This is the story of the Irish Civil War. Not the battles, not the politics, but the thing that made it the most psychologically devastating conflict in modern Irish history. The fact that the people doing the killing had, months earlier, been willing to die for each other. To understand how Ireland arrived at a place where brothers aimed rifles at brothers and best men signed the death warrants of their own groomsmen, you have to understand the document that split the country in two. On the 6th of December, 1921, 5 Irish delegates signed the Anglo-Irish Treaty in London. The treaty created the Irish Free State, a self-governing dominion within the British Empire. It gave Ireland its own parliament, its own army, its own courts. British troops would leave. The centuries-old dream of Irish self-governance was, on paper, achieved. But the treaty came with conditions that were, for many, unbearable. Members of the new Irish Parliament would be required to swear an oath of allegiance to the British Crown. Northern Ireland, with its 6 predominantly unionist counties, would be partitioned off. The Irish Free State would remain within the British Empire, not as a sovereign republic, but as a dominion, like Canada or Australia. For Michael Collins, the charismatic finance minister and intelligence chief who had masterminded the guerrilla war against Britain, the treaty was pragmatic. He told the Dial that it gave Ireland not the ultimate freedom that all nations aspire to, but the freedom to achieve freedom. For others, particularly those who had bled and been tortured and watched friends die for the Republic proclaimed during the Easter Rising of 1916, the treaty was a betrayal. It was not what they had fought for. It was not what their dead had died for. And no amount of pragmatism could make an oath to the British Crown anything other than a surrender of the very principle that had started the revolution. The Dial vote on the treaty on the 7th of January, 1922, was 64 in favour, 57 against. A margin of 7 votes. 7 votes to determine whether Ireland would accept a compromise or continue fighting for a republic. De Valera walked out. The IRA split. And across every county, every parish, every family in Ireland, a question was asked that had no safe answer. Which side are you on? In the rolling farmland outside Bandon, in West Cork, there was a family that had never had to ask that question before. The Hales family of Knocknacarra, Ballinaddy, had been fighting the British for generations. Robert Hales, the father, was an activist in the Irish Land War and a reputed member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. His wife Margaret, née Fitzgerald, raised 9 children on the family farm, and the household was steeped in the language and culture of Irish resistance. 5 of those children were sons, and by 1916, when the Easter Rising shook Dublin, 4 of them were already members of the Irish Volunteers. The 2 who would come to embody the tragedy of the Civil War were Sian, born in 1880, and Tom, born in 1892. 12 years apart in age, but bound by the same cause. Both became company commanders in the IRA in the Bandon area during the War of Independence. Both were closely associated with Michael Collins, Tom Barry, and Liam Deasy. Both risked their lives in ambushes, raids, and intelligence operations against the Royal Irish Constabulary and the British Army. A fifth brother, Donald, operated from Genoa as the Irish Republic's consular agent in Italy, running propaganda and attempting to smuggle weapons captured from Austrian stocks through the connections of Gabriele D'Annunzio. But it was Tom Hales whose experience during the War of Independence would sear itself most deeply into the family's story. On the 26th of July, 1920, Tom and fellow IRA officer Pat Hart were arrested by soldiers from the Essex Regiment. What happened next was documented in Tom's own military pension application and in the Bureau of Military History witness statements held at the Irish Military Archives. Tom Hales was beaten. He was threatened with being blown up. And, according to the records, he had a fingernail torn out during interrogation. The officer overseeing operations in the area at that time was Captain Arthur Percival of the Essex Regiment, a man who would later achieve a very different kind of notoriety as the British general who surrendered Singapore to the Japanese in 1942. Tom Hales survived the torture. He did not break. He gave the British nothing. And when he was eventually released, he resumed command of the 3rd Cork Brigade of the IRA with a reputation forged not only in combat, but in suffering. Sean Hales, meanwhile, had taken a different but parallel path. By the elections of 1921, he was elected to the 2nd Dáil as a Sinn Féin member for Cork. He was both a politician and a soldier, a brigadier general in the IRA who understood the war from both the trenches and the parliamentary benches. When the truce came in July 1921, both brothers had every reason to believe they were on the same side of history. They had fought together against the same enemy. They had buried the same friends. They came from the same house, the same table, the same blood. Then the treaty arrived, and the Hales family fractured. Sean Hales supported the treaty. He believed, as Collins did, that it was a stepping stone, an imperfect instrument that could be built upon. He was re-elected to the 3rd Dáil in the 1922 general election as a pro-treaty Sinn Féin TD, receiving 4,374 first preference votes. He became a brigadier general in the newly formed National Army of the Irish Free State. Tom Hales rejected the treaty. The man who had endured British torture, who had watched British soldiers tear his fingernails out, could not bring himself to accept an oath of allegiance to the British Crown. He was elected to the anti-treaty IRA executive in March 1922. When the Civil War erupted in June, Tom resumed his old rank as commander of the 3rd Cork Brigade, now fighting not against the British, but against the Irish Free State. Against the government his own brother served. According to historian Liz Gillis, whose book The Hales Brothers and the Irish Revolution, published by Mercier Press, draws on the military archives and interviews with the Hales family, the brothers never openly criticized one another for their rival political stances. There were no public denunciations, no family excommunications, but the silence between them was, in its own way, louder than any argument. Because the logic of civil war does not care about family bonds. It has its own momentum. And in the summer and autumn of 1922, that momentum was accelerating toward catastrophe. On the 22nd of August, 1922, Michael Collins, the commander-in-chief of the Free State Army, traveled in a military convoy through West Cork. He was visiting troops, inspecting positions, and his itinerary included a stop at the Munster Arms Hotel in Bandon, where he was to meet with Sean Hales. Collins' column stopped at a crossroads called Béal na Emblath, which translates from the Irish as the mouth of flowers, to ask for directions to Bandon. The man they asked happened to be a member of the anti-treaty IRA. Word spread quickly. Plans were set in motion to ambush Collins on his return journey. What happened next has been the subject of a century of historical debate, but certain facts are documented beyond dispute. Sean Hales, the pro-treaty brother, met with Collins in Bandon. and according to multiple accounts, including those cited by Gillis, advised him not to travel back through Béal na Mblath. Collins ignored the advice. And when his convoy returned through the crossroads that evening, an anti-treaty IRA ambush party was waiting. Tom Hales, the anti-treaty brother, was the most senior Republican officer on the scene at Béal na Mblath. According to the historical record compiled by the military archives and corroborated by multiple sources, Tom's 3rd Cork Brigade was responsible for the ambush. Collins, characteristically, ordered his convoy to stop and fight rather than speed through the kill zone. He took a rifle and advanced along the road toward his attackers. A bullet struck him in the back of the head. Michael Collins, the most charismatic figure of the Irish Revolution, was dead at the age of 31. He was the only fatality of the ambush. Consider the geometry of that single day. One brother warns Collins not to go. The other brother is waiting in the hedgerows when he does. One is trying to save the life of the man who represents their shared cause. The other has decided that the same man represents the betrayal of that cause, and the man himself, the big fella, walks into the space between them and dies. But the spiral had only begun. In the months that followed, the Irish Free State government, now led by William T. Cosgrave after both Collins and Arthur Griffith had died in August, faced an escalating guerrilla war. Anti-treaty IRA units attacked railways, bridges, post offices, and military positions. The government responded with emergency powers. On the 17th of November, 1922, the Free State began executing Republican prisoners under legislation known as the Public Safety Bill. Among the first to be executed was Erskine Childers, who had served as secretary to the very delegation that negotiated the treaty. Liam Lynch, the anti-treaty IRA chief of staff, responded with what historians have called the Orders of Frightfulness. He ordered that any TD who had voted for what Republicans called the Murder Bill was to be killed. National Army officers who served on military courts were to be killed. The houses of TDs, senators, and pro-treaty supporters were to be burned. On the 7th of December 1922, those orders were acted upon. Members of the anti-treaty IRA Dublin Active Service Unit ambushed 2 TDs as they emerged from lunch at a hotel on Ormond Quay, along Dublin's River Liffey, 10 minutes' walk from the still-ruined Four Courts. One of the TDs was Padraig O'Malley of Mayo, the deputy speaker of the Dáil, who was shot and badly wounded. The other was Seán Hales of Cork. He was killed. According to John Dorney of the Irish Story, who has extensively documented this episode, the IRA's Dublin Brigade commander, Frank Henderson, had apparently ordered the killing of O'Malley specifically as the deputy speaker, and was dismayed that Hales had been killed. Whether Seán Hales was an intended target or not, he was dead. The man who had survived the War of Independence, who had been elected by the people of Cork, who had warned Michael Collins not to ride to his death, was shot down on a Dublin quay at the age of 42. The Hales family, already divided, was now in mourning, and the man whose side Seán had chosen was about to respond in a way that would define the moral horror of the Irish Civil War. The Free State Cabinet met in an emergency session that night. After an all-night debate, they decided on retaliatory executions, not of anyone connected to the assassination of Seán Hales, not of anyone who had been tried or convicted of any crime related to his death. They chose 4 Republican leaders who had been captured at the Four Courts the previous June, 5 months before the emergency legislation even existed. Their names were Liam Mellows, Rory O'Connor, Joe McKelvey, and Richard Barrett. Each represented one of Ireland's 4 provinces. Each had been a senior figure in the anti-treaty IRA. And each was woken in Mountjoy prison and handed a typed notice. The text of that notice, preserved in the archives of University College Dublin's Mulcahy Papers, read, You are hereby notified that being a person taken in arms against the government, you will be executed as a reprisal for the assassination of Brigadier Sean Hales TD in Dublin on December 7th, on his way to a meeting of Dáil Éireann, and as a solemn warning to those associated with you who are engaged in a conspiracy of assassination against the representatives of the Irish people. They were shot by firing squad at 8 o'clock in the morning on the 8th of December 1922. There was no trial, no court-martial, no legal proceeding of any kind. As the contemporary Labour Party leader Tom Johnson said at the time, the executions were outside any framework of law. In 2022, then Taoiseach Michel Martin acknowledged that the 4 executions were, in his words, murder by any definition. And here is where the story reaches the point that no novelist would dare invent because it would seem too cruel to be believed. One of the 4 men executed that morning was Rory O'Connor, the same Rory O'Connor who, 13 months earlier, had stood as best man at the wedding of Kevin O'Higgins, the same O'Higgins who, as Minister for Home Affairs, was one of the cabinet members who voted for the executions. They had attended the same Jesuit school at Clongowes Wood. They had fought together in the Revolution. O'Connor had risen to become the IRA's Director of Engineering, masterminding prison escapes and operations in Britain. O'Higgins had become one of the most powerful politicians in the new state. And when the treaty split them apart, neither could find a way back to the other. According to research published in the Irish Times in March 2026, drawing on the O'Higgins papers and National Library of Ireland photographs, O'Connor had sewn into the lining of his coat 2 gold guineas that O'Higgins had given him as a wedding gift. He was wearing them when he was executed. In one of his final letters, written in his cell in Mountjoy, O'Connor expressed forgiveness for his enemies. He did not name O'Higgins. He did not have to. The rest of the Hales family, according to the historical record cited by Gillis and multiple sources, remained staunchly anti-treaty and publicly denounced the executions that followed their brother Sean's assassination. The executions were, after all, carried out in Sean's name. His death was the stated justification. But the family did not accept that 4 men should die as a reprisal for one, and they did not accept that the government Sean had supported had the right to execute prisoners without trial. The Irish Civil War would continue for another 5 months after those December executions. According to the UCC Irish Civil War Fatalities project, the first systematic attempt to count all those killed, conducted in 2023 under the Government of Ireland's Decade of Centenaries programme, the total was 1,426 violent deaths in the 26 counties of the Free State between the 28th of June, 1922, and the 24th of May, 1923. Of those, 648 were pro-treaty forces. 438 were anti-treaty IRA, and 336 were civilians. The National Army, Sean Hales's army, suffered the greatest losses. 81 Republicans were officially executed by firing squad. The number of unauthorized or extrajudicial killings of Republican prisoners has been estimated as high as 153. The atrocities were not confined to one side. In County Kerry, where the guerrilla war was most bitter, National Army troops tied 9 Republican prisoners to a landmine at Ballyseedy and detonated it, killing 8. One man, Stephen Fuller, was blown clear by the blast and survived. In Dublin, Republican gunmen systematically targeted TDs and their families. In February 1923, anti-treaty IRA men arrived at the O'Higgins family home in Stradbally, County Lois, to burn it. They shot and killed Kevin O'Higgins's 64-year-old father, Thomas Higgins. In the same period, an uncle of William T. Cosgrave was also killed by Republicans. On the 24th of May, 1923, Eamon de Valera issued an order to the anti-treaty forces to lay down their arms. "Soldiers of the Republic, Legion of the Rearguard," he wrote, The Republic can no longer be defended successfully by your arms. Further sacrifice of life would now be in vain. Tom Hales had been arrested in November 1922, imprisoned first in Cork and then at the Curragh military detention camp. He took part in a 14-day hunger strike before his release in December 1923. He never publicly spoke against his dead brother Sion. He never publicly acknowledged his role in the ambush that killed Collins. He returned to the family farm in Knocknacarra and eventually settled into a quieter life, respected in his community, but carrying, as so many did, the private weight of a war that had no clean answers. Kevin O'Higgins carried his own weight. He became the second most powerful politician in the Irish Free State, a man described by Winston Churchill as a figure of comparable quality to Mussolini and even Napoleon. He was ruthless, efficient, and haunted. On the 10th of July, 1927, O'Higgins was walking from his home on Cross Avenue in Blackrock to Sunday Mass. He had been accompanied by an armed detective, but had sent the man back to buy cigarettes. 3 men from the IRA, Timothy Coughlin, Bill Gannon, and Archie Doyle, emerged from a parked car and opened fire. O'Higgins was hit 8 times. He did not die for almost 5 hours. He was 35 years old. Among the surviving papers of Kevin O'Higgins, preserved in the archives, there is a letter of condolence from Rory O'Connor's sister, Eilidh. It reads, in part, "Words are of little avail in times of grief, but I would like to offer you from myself and the whole family our most heartfelt sympathy. May God console you as He alone can." The sister of the man O'Higgins had ordered executed, writing to the widow of the man who had ordered the execution. In Ireland, this is what peace looked like. The UCC Fatalities project revealed something else about the Irish Civil War that cuts against the popular narrative. The total death toll, approximately 1,500 across the island, was actually lower than the 2,346 killed during the War of Independence. In terms of sheer numbers, the war against the British was bloodier. But the Civil War felt worse. It felt worse because the killing was intimate, because the people pulling triggers knew the names of the people they were shooting, because the divisions ran not between nations or empires or even ideologies, but through families, friendships, and the small daily bonds that hold communities together. The political legacy of that division is still visible. The pro-treaty side became Cumann nan Gael Hale, which later merged into Fine Gael. The anti-treaty side eventually became Fianna Fáil. These two parties dominated Irish politics for the entire 20th century and into the 21st, their rivalry rooted not in left versus right, not in economic policy or social vision, but in a question asked in 1922, which side were you on? Families in Ireland knew which side their grandparents had been on the way families in other countries know which church they belonged to. It was inherited. It was felt. And for decades, it was not discussed. The National Museum of Ireland, in its permanent exhibition, Bitter Divisions, frames the central question of the Civil War this way. How did men who had fought together for the ideal of a free and independent Ireland come to kill each other? The museum's answer is that the division was, to a great extent, between those who had worked closely with Michael Collins and been influenced by his charismatic personality, and those fighters far from Dublin who had followed other local leaders with different views. Few of the IRA commanders in the field supported the treaty. The majority of rank-and-file men followed their local commander. It was not that one side loved Ireland more than the other. It was that both sides loved Ireland with an intensity that left no room for compromise. In 2017, a bronze sculpture was unveiled in Middleton, County Cork, not far from the Hales family farm in Ballinadee. It depicts 9 eagle feathers, representing the 9 members of the Hales family, rising from the earth and reaching toward the sky. But the sculpture is not about the Hales. It is called Kindred Spirits. and it commemorates the donation made by the Choctaw Nation to Irish famine relief in 1847. Its placement in Cork, in the heartland of the Civil War, is a reminder that Ireland's history of suffering extends far deeper than the 1920s, and that solidarity can cross oceans and centuries. But the wounds of the Civil War crossed something more intimate than oceans. They crossed kitchen tables. They crossed shared bedrooms. They crossed the invisible line between a man and his brother, between a groom and his best man, between a father and the government that claimed to act in his son's name. The Irish Civil War Fatalities Project, in cataloguing every documented death, discovered that more pro-treaty soldiers died from accidents, including firearms, mishaps, friendly fire, and motor vehicle incidents, than from any single category other than direct enemy action. Almost 31% of pro-treaty fatalities were accidental. These were young men, many of them barely trained, given weapons and uniforms, and asked to fight their neighbors. They were dying not only from bullets, but from the chaos of a conflict that nobody had been prepared for, because the enemy they had trained to fight was supposed to be British, not Irish. Hales was 42 when he was killed on Ormonde Quay. Tom Hales was 30 when the Civil War began and lived until 1966, dying at the age of 74. He never held high political office, though he remained active in Republican politics and was elected to the Dial as an abstentionist TD. The 12 years between the brothers' ages meant that they experienced the revolution from different vantage points. Sian was old enough to be a pragmatist. Tom was young enough and scarred enough by British torture to be an absolutist. Neither was wrong in the way that people with clean hands and comfortable lives can afford to say someone is wrong. Both were trapped by a treaty that demanded a choice no family should have to make. In the archives of the Military Service Pensions Collection, held at the Irish Military Archives in Cathal Brugha Barracks, Dublin, there are thousands of applications from veterans of both the War of Independence and the Civil War. These files, digitized and made available to researchers in recent years, contain the bureaucratic details of revolution, dates of service, ranks held, injuries sustained, pensions claimed. They are, in their clinical language, among the most devastating documents in Irish history, because they record, in the handwriting of the men and women who lived through it, exactly what happened. Tom Hales's file notes his torture. Sian Hales's file notes his election, his rank, his service. Neither file mentions the other brother. The state's records of their service do not acknowledge that they were family, that they came from the same house. That one survived the war, and one did not. On the morning of the 8th of December, 1922, before Rory O'Connor was taken to face the firing squad in Mountjoy Prison, he was told by a priest that his execution was a reprisal for the assassination of Sian Hales. O'Connor, who had been captured at the Four Courts 5 months earlier and had no connection to the Hales assassination, reportedly asked what Sian Hales had to do with him. The answer, of course, was nothing, and everything. Because in the logic of civil war, every death justifies the next. Every killing demands a reprisal. Every reprisal creates new grief that demands its own response. And the chain does not break until someone decides that the dead are dead enough. Eamon de Valera, the man who had stood in the back row of O'Higgins's wedding photograph, the man who had walked out of the Dial over the treaty, the man who had issued the order to dump arms in May 1923, would go on to dominate Irish politics for the next half-century. He founded Fianna Fáil in 1926, entered the Dial in 1927, became President of the Executive Council in 1932, and served as President of Ireland until 1973. He died in 1975 at the age of 92. The divisions of the Civil War did not die with him. They merely became quieter. In every parish in Ireland, there are families who know which side their people were on. There are graveyards where the dead of both sides lie within yards of each other. separated in death only by the dates on their headstones and the silence of the living. There are stories that grandmothers told in kitchens and grandfathers did not tell at all. There are pension files in the archives and witness statements in the Bureau of Military History and photographs in the National Library that document, with the cold precision of bureaucracy, the human cost of a war fought between people who loved the same country and could not agree on what that love required. The Irish Civil War killed fewer people than the war against the British. The UCC project confirmed that. 1,485 deaths across the island, compared to over 2,300 in the War of Independence. But the numbers do not capture the thing that made the Civil War different. The War of Independence had clarity. The enemy wore a different uniform, spoke with a different accent, represented a foreign power. The Civil War had none of that. The enemy wore the same face, spoke the same language, and fought for the same country. The enemy had been at your wedding. The enemy had been in your trench. The enemy had grown up in the room next to yours, eating at the same table, praying to the same God, dreaming of the same free Ireland. On the 27th of October, 1921, 3 men stood together in a wedding photograph in Dublin. One would be executed by order of the second. The second would be assassinated in reprisal. The third would build a state on the ruins of their friendship and live long enough to see it become something neither of them had imagined. In a farmhouse in Knocknacurra, Ballinadee, County Cork, 2 brothers grew up together, fought together, and were separated by a treaty that asked them to choose between a flawed freedom and a perfect dream. One of them died for it, the other lived with it. And the country they both claimed to love spent the next 100 years trying to decide which of them was right, without ever quite having the courage to say that both of them were, and that this was the worst part of all.